morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. We kind of warned him. We're a little bit passionate about services, so he's ready.
Yeah, I'm ready for that. That's right. I've got my chamomile tea, so I can take anything up.
So as you all know, the mission of the Council of Economic Advisors is to advise and formulate policy, economic policy for the White House, and to ensure that all the government departments are working in unison to advance the economic agenda of the executive branch. And as the chairman of the CEA, Kevin Hassett is the president's chief economist. And I know you all have his bio in the summit booklet, but I just kind of wanted to highlight, in addition to being an expert on economics, he is an expert on public policy. He knows public policy. He has great ideas about how to improve public policy. And he's someone who is constantly looking for ways to expand the role of economic policy and its implications in a real-world kind of way. He gets the substance. And so...
Could you get that message to Peter Navarro for me?
Done.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
And so I think we're really fortunate today to have Kevin with us today and to be able to get that perspective from the White House. And so maybe if you want to just open on just some opening remarks, and then we'll kind of dive into some questions. Sure. And then turn it over to the audience for some additional questions.
Sure, thanks. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I know what important work you do, both services GDP is about 2/3 of GDP, something like that usually. And also service industries make even the goods industries more productive. And so, this idea that output in one area of the economy is more important than output in another is not one that, we at the CEA share. I think that the big headline, economic headline for us since we basically got to Washington, I've been in my job since about a year ago, June, is that as President Trump was elected, as he took office, then the economics profession and certainly the professional staffs around town basically had told us that there was a new normal, that we're going to be growing as we did in the last year of the Obama administration, 1.6%, growing about that fast forever. And the story of the economists, especially the economists in the previous administration, was that it wasn't their glorious policies that led to the new normal. It was like this new fait accompli that was handed to us by the Martians or something. It was just like there's this new normal, it's inexorable, and we're stuck in the ones forever. And President Trump argued on the campaign trail, and I certainly argued over at the American Enterprise Institute where I was research director, that, well, no, actually, there is a possible return to normal that is in the cards if one is willing to pursue improved policies. And the three policies that really jumped out at you were one, tax policy. Mm-hmm. As you guys all suffered through it, right? We were the high corporate tax place on earth, and we had this weird system where if you earned money offshore, then you didn't have to pay U.S. tax, and if you left it offshore, then you could avoid U.S. tax forever. And so we actually saw companies doing this, that something that was, say, a U.S. manufacturing firm forever would locate a plant in Ireland, and then say they were selling the product in the U.S. for $10, say it's a bar of soap, $10 a bar, then they would make it in Ireland, and the U.S. parent would pay the Irish sub $15 a bar, and then they would sell it for $10 a bar in the U.S., and the U.S. parent would post a $5 a bar loss, and they'd have this huge profit in Ireland. And when the U.S. parent posted the loss, they could carry the loss back and get refunded past taxes. And so we actually had U.S. taxpayers cutting checks to build factories offshore and give jobs to citizens of other countries. Now, I'm Irish heritage. I was in Ireland meeting with the Prime Minister a few weeks ago, and no hard feelings. God bless them for taking advantage of it. But tax policy was a big problem. Regulation was a big problem. Regulations had grown in the previous 8 years at a ridiculously fast pace. And one metric of it that I think, looking through all the data, that really jumps out at me is that, the NFIB, the Small Business Bureau, they put out lots of different data, and the small business was really on the ropes and in the dumps by 2016. And one metric of it that I found quite striking is that the NFIB Legal Center in 2016 had 8 active cases where they had felt that they had to launch lawsuits against the Obama administration to try to push back on their tough and costly regulations. But imagine if you've actually got the business organization has got to actually launch lawsuits to stop regulations. It's a metric that maybe the government's out of control, especially small businesses have the hardest time, I think, dealing with regulations. And I could add that they haven't launched any lawsuits against President Trump because there's basically no new regulations. Since we're rolling back things. And the third thing is trade. That President Trump talked about, something I didn't appreciate very much because I was never a trade scholar when I worked at the American Enterprise Institute. But when economists model free trade, we all love free trade, then basically free trade is there's no tariffs, and non-tariff barriers aren't even in our models really, right? So it's just like tariffs are the only thing. And if you have high tariffs, then the economic models are unhappy. If you have low tariffs, the economic models are happy. And so when I came in and I saw that we had things like free trade deals with these guys or those guys, then I thought, oh, that's good. We don't have tariffs. But then you would look at the details of the deals, and I found, and CEA in the Economic Report of the President wrote this up a lot last year, that it's kind of amazing how feckless previous trade negotiators have been. And now I know there are a couple of USTR people that are here doing a great job. You only did the good deals for the Coalition of Services Industries, but you could see stuff like the old Korean deal. We had a free trade deal with Korea, and they opened up their market to our autos, and we opened up our market to their autos, and then they started selling millions of cars here in the U.S., and we sold like precisely 0 cars almost in Korea. And when I started to ask the trade staff to explain to me, the economists who said, well, there's no tariff, so why is it this happening? Then it turns out that they had these really complicated non-tariff barriers that made it essentially impossible to sell U.S. cars. Well, if everybody else's market is more or less closed to our stuff, and this is especially true with services, right?
Yes.
And our market is wide open to their stuff, then that disadvantages U.S. workers, and is another reason why exports could be growing slower than you would like, and it's an opportunity for reform. And so I think that if we look back at what we've accomplished in the last 2 years, what President Trump's team has accomplished, then there's a big tax bill that's had the predicted effects, a big surge in capital spending, and growth was 4.2% last quarter. It's looking like we're going to get the new number next week for third quarter, and that's looking like it's going to be a little bit below 4. Mm-hmm. And deregulation, there's a million stats that you've seen about all the progress we've made. We have stopped new regulations in their tracks and rolled back more than 2,000 regulations. And the trade bill, I think that's something that has probably made people the most nervous as we've gone through the negotiations, because as we were, introducing tariffs and doing things to prove to our trading partners and our friends that, hey, we're serious about moving towards reciprocity and fairness in trade deals, well, they got the message, because if you look at the USMCA, it's a big improvement over NAFTA. We could talk about why. And so I think that President Trump has really accomplished a lot in his first year and a half or so, and it's the main reason why economic growth has gone from, the new normal back to just normal.
Yeah. I have to say, UPS was one of those companies. We were one of the highest taxpayers in the world, and
right, because you were stuck here basically. I know you have international business, but
happily here delivering for our customers.
But you can't transfer price so well.
but the tax reform effort was really powerful for us, and we've reinvested a lot of that savings back into expansion of our facilities here across the United States.
And you announced pay increases too, right?
Pay increases, as well as the purchase of additional Boeing aircraft, and so that was powerful for our company, and we know for a lot of our customers, and we are big champions of the deregulatory effort, because that has unleashed a lot more economic growth.
Can I say, just because when we say deregulation, then it's really common for everybody's eyes to kind of glaze over, and it's just this abstract kind of thing. But it turns out that as we look at it, now I'm not the one who actually does it, but I do go to meetings where we talk about, what happens if we do this, what happens if we do that. The actual practice of deregulation is really fun. It's quite satisfying in a way that government work often isn't. And I'll give you an example. There was this regulation on the books about helicopters that said that before a helicopter could be sold, then it had to be flown outdoors at night by a test pilot to make sure that the ambient light inside didn't reflect off the glass of the helicopter in a way where you couldn't see the ground and then you'd have a crash. But you can imagine that that's a pretty dangerous job for the test pilot. And so the average cost for that test flight was a little shy of $40,000. And so every single helicopter sold in the US cost $40,000 more because they had to do that. And then somebody who spoke with guys who know helicopters of the Coast Guard basically got the idea that, well, instead, why don't we just leave it in the factory floor and turn out the lights? Mm-hmm. And then turn the lights on inside the helicopter and see what the reflections are like, and can't we come up with a test that doesn't require flying, that you just can just put it in a dark room and see if there's reflection? And then they did that, they got that to work, and so now the cost of complying with this safety regulation is basically zero. And every helicopter in America, that's kind of satisfying, right? So when we say that there's thousands of things that are being rolled back, a lot of them are like that. And so I think that it's just common sense that it would have a positive effect, say, for that one on the sales of helicopters, because it's so much cheaper.
With that enthusiasm, we're going to give you a new superhero name, Kevin the Bad Regulation Slayer, and we'll come with a list from the transportation industry, because we've got some more that I think would be worthy of getting
happy
rid
to look
of.
for good ideas. It's one of my favorite games that I play with my children, is you have to invent new superheroes.
Well, there you go.
My favorite is Breadcrumb, he never gets lost.
I want to turn to trade policy. So surplus. We have a services surplus, $255 billion as of 2017. Yet at the beginning of this administration, there wasn't a lot of focus on services. But you and I both know you can't make it, move it, buy it, or sell it without services. And so it was initially kind of challenging to get that focus on the importance of trade and services. Do you see now going forward that there's a better recognition of the important role that services plays in the U.S. economy, as well as its key to U.S. global competitiveness? Do you see that shift happening away from what was originally only focus on the goods, focus on the trade deficits, and trade deficits narrowly defined to only goods?
You know, that's a great question. And of course, services are a big success story in the U.S. for our economy and for our trade. And so then the question is, why bother at all thinking about like goods versus services when you're thinking about economic policy? And for that, I would point towards an economic literature. There's this guy at MIT named Otter and a fellow at Yale, Peter Schott, that have looked at the impact of China entering the WTO on different geographic regions around the U.S. And they had this really interesting experiment that, I don't know, I'm certainly old enough to remember. There used to be this time where every year we had to pass a law that gave China a most favored nation's trading status. And it was an act that had to be made by Congress. Otherwise, if they didn't get that status, then, believe it or not, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs went into effect on China. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about whether or not the Smoot-Hawley tariffs would go in effect on China. And the uncertainty was there, even though people pretty much expected every year China would get the status. Well, what the economists did is they said, well, geez, you know, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs varied a lot by product. And so therefore, what that meant was that the uncertainty over China getting that status would have protected some areas of the country a lot more than others, depending on whether they made a product that, you know, would have a really high tariff if China got stuck not being a most favored nation. And then they looked at the cross-section variation in basically the harm from China entering the WTO, and found that there were pockets around the country where basically towns were destroyed, regions were destroyed, because they had previously been protected by China not being in the WTO, and as soon as China went into the WTO, then it caused, you know, just massive destruction. And there are follow-on papers that show that, you know, unemployment rates go up to around 20 in some of these geographic regions and stay there. Divorce rates skyrocket, suicide rates skyrocket, opioid abuse skyrockets, and so one of the big social problems I think that has emerged over the last couple of decades in the U.S. is that geographic inequality has skyrocketed. And the geographic inequality is highly correlated basically with having been a goods producer that was previously protected by this weird status that China had. And so there's a big academic literature on that. And so I think that generally speaking, you know, when you talk to the president, he's absolutely a trade reformer. He wants zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers. He's very intolerant of the kind of unfair asymmetries that we've seen. But he's also, if you look at like the blue wall that wasn't there, he's also spoken in a way to those people that have suffered through the geographic inequality and promised to deliver for them. And I think that puts a little bit of an extra oomph on his focus on goods.
Right, but let's come back to on the services side. You and I were talking before about services generally pay more than most manufacturing jobs, and if you really narrow in to tradable services, the wage increase is quite significant. I'm pretty darn proud of the fact that UPS is one of the best employers out there in terms of wages and benefits for our drivers and all the folks involved in the logistics space. How
is it true that they don't take left turns?
We don't take left turns.
It's really true?
It's all about being green and, you know, efficiency.
So you don't take left turns, really?
Well,
under any circumstance?
Only if absolutely necessary, but
okay.
We try to avoid.
So it would help you if we put a tax on left turns?
No.
Because your competitors would all have to pay it.
We're believers in let business do what it does well and don't regulate. But the idea of how do we get you know, more of that attention on addressing the opportunities for growing the services economy, particularly in a lot of those towns, admittedly, some of the jobs were lost, but what about the opportunities about growing services jobs and allowing for the expansion of services companies to be able to engage in business around the world? Because as you and I were talking about, it's not about tariffs for services. It's about all the other regulations and ability to go into markets and restrictions in terms of our ability to be able to grow and expand overseas. How do we get more of a focus on addressing some of those issues in a free trade context?
Well, I could say that the two of you guys know USTR and the details about negotiations over services better than I do, for sure. And so I won't try to you know, explain to the group better than you could the positive movement in services in the U.S. MCA, the digital agreements and so on. But I can say that it's definitely on our radar. I was, as an example, I was in Ireland. It was covered a lot in the Irish press just a few weeks ago, talking about data protection stuff with the Prime Minister. That, you know, we understand that there's a lot of work to do to make sure that trade regulations are sort of consistent with 21st century practices. But I think that the most important thing that as a CEA chair I can do is to make sure that for the most part the government policy doesn't pick winners and losers, that we create an environment for overall success where you can have 4% GDP growth, the lowest unemployment rate since 1969 and so on, and then let the economy evolve the way it needs to evolve and not be disturbed if, you know, that means that services grows.
Right, and I would just reinforce that point by saying that if we enable U.S. services companies to be more competitive, we'll be able to help grow on the goods side, you know, the opportunities, the economic opportunities and the jobs, because we kind of go hand in hand, and when services companies can compete globally, we know we can help U.S. exports go farther. So, but let's turn to the USMCA, since you touched on it. And I will say, we had our board meeting last night, and we all talked about the really fantastic language that was included in the agreement that really modernized what was the NAFTA and focused on digital trade issues specifically, because those have been some of the challenges that we've been facing. There was also a lot of great work on...
Can I actually ask you a question about that, which is that our view after studying those things is that the digital part of USMCA should be a model for all our other trade deals. Is there something in the USMCA that you think shouldn't be part of a model for other trade deals? Would you, like for the digital side, or do you think that we got it right?
We think that, and I don't want to speak for the companies
group.
in the room, but
speak for yourself.
From the UPS perspective, we think it's tremendously valuable that that there was strong language in there with respect to data localization. Everybody thinks it's just financial services companies, but the reality is every company in America now that is involved in services depends on the movement of data, and data localization requirements really hamstring all of our operations, including UPS's. Some of the important provisions provisions in there that governed the ability to use data without some of the restrictions that were increasingly being put in place with respect to new technologies, the cloud, and how those kinds of services could be used to really enhance productivity and enhance cross-border flows was really important. So from that perspective, it was a major step forward, and it built on what had already been accomplished in the TPP agreement. And so some really important strides made. And I would say, as a company that is more than just a logistics company. We care about every package in our cargo hold or our package car. It's all about the small and medium-sized businesses, and a lot of the digital trade language, as well as the language that covered making trade more inclusive so small and medium-sized businesses could engage more in the global economy. There's some powerful language in there that's tremendously valuable that we hope will enable companies that use the internet, that use e-commerce, to not just trade their goods within the United States, but take American goods and take them global. And this was real enabling legislation or language in the trade agreement. So from that perspective, we think there were some important strides made. I know there's some issues in the USMCA that many companies would like to still see addressed. From a very parochial perspective, we think if you improve border processes, you can facilitate a lot of trade, and some of the de minimis language we think could have been strengthened and improved, and we're going to continue the advocacy efforts, particularly with Mexico, to help them recognize changing those border processes is going to be great for them and their companies as well as ours in terms of enhancing cross-border trade. But I'd be interested in your perspective. We've got a long way to go. I know the Mexicans hopefully will move to implement the agreement by December 1. We understand Trudeau will probably follow suit. The U.S., we know, will probably move in early 2019. How do you see the USMCA serving as a basis for enhancing American competitiveness in the North American supply chain, realm, as well as do you think it can serve as that model with respect to, for example, Japan, UK, Europe?
Well, indeed, if you sort of watch the news, that we've made a heck of a lot of progress with Europe, with the UK, with Japan. We've closed a deal with Korea, and all those deals are going to look pretty much alike and very much like this. And I think that President Trump said maybe about a year ago, June. It was one of my first presentation in the White House was at a trade meeting. So, walking right into the sort of most contentious issue at the time. But he basically said, well, we're going to work hard to get a good deal, and we're going to do it with a sort of narrow set of countries, maybe one, or maybe, and so in the end, he said, I'd rather negotiate with one country, make a really great deal, and then tell everybody else, hey, you want this? You can have it. And he thought that was a lot easier than negotiating with lots of countries all at once, because it's just much harder to get 8 people to agree to something. But if you come up with a good thing, and then he said, so once I get a deal with one country, I bet you that they're just going to cascade the deals. And we're starting to see that that's what's happening. And so I think it is basically a model. And I think the other thing about it that I think hasn't been really covered as much as it should have been is that the deal really should be quite attractive on a bipartisan basis to people of all parties in the U.S. And since this deal should be, because it has labor protections that organized labor in the U.S. that they've sought forever. It has really interesting environmental protections so that it's no longer the case that we're going to export the pollution to Mexico. Even extremely important, urgent environmental things that everybody should care about, like ocean litter, right? And so I think that it's the kind of deal that really should get a massive amount of bipartisan support, which would then make it so that all the other deals do as well. And so I think that Ambassador Lighthizer and President Trump really deserve a lot of credit, coming up with a deal that improves so much, that does so in a way that really ought to get bipartisan support. And I know this is a time where there's very little bipartisan anything, but I think that if you look, Senator Schumer came out after he saw USMCA and he said, wow, it looks like a pretty good deal. And I think that you know, I was gratified that he did that, and I'm sure I know Ambassador Lighthizer was, because it is a really good deal, and trade is really important. And if we think about those distressed communities and everything else, that there's a lot of good we can do for real people's lives if we can change the law.
You know, and I have to admit that when President Trump came in, and one of the first actions was to not go forward with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, there was an underlying concern about the fact that we need to be raising standards for trade, particularly for trade and services, across a variety of regions, and really having allies for high standards, particularly with the strong presence of China in many countries, and in many ways lowering standards. And so this is truly another path to achieving that same objective by getting other like-minded countries to adopt those higher standards. And so it's going to be really important that a lot of the breakthroughs that were made in the USMCA, particularly with raising standards for trade, do get incorporated. And some of the issues that I know industry still has concerns about, I hope the administration will be open to thinking about, because the reality is we want to be raising those standards anywhere and everywhere and having like-minded countries with us, so that some of the concerns that are underlying the Trump administration's tariff actions can really go to addressing those by putting pressure on China to raise its standards and not lower them.
Yeah, and again, I think that you would probably agree that that for a while, probably people watching the process wondered whether President Trump really wanted better deals, he really was a trade reformer, or whether he just wanted to slap tariffs on everything. And now that we've got the good deals, then I think that it should lead to a positive feedback loop where we've shown that we are willing to agree to a solid, sensible thing that doesn't disadvantage our trading partners, that should be attractive to our other trading partners, and that will keep our word once we make such an agreement. And so therefore you should come and you should deal with us. So that's what we're seeing. Again, there's a real avalanche of approaches going on right now. And again, the one place where it's more tricky still is China.
We touched on it early on, the World Trade Organization. And full disclosure, I was involved in the basic telecom and financial services negotiations as part of the WTO. And there is tremendous value in what the institution brings in terms of really raising standards for trade. And when I think about it from a services perspective, a lot of the commitments that are in the General Agreement on Trade and Services are so important in creating that foundation so that American services companies can really have more of a level playing field around the world, because as we discussed, it's not as simple as just lowering tariffs. For services, there's so many other barriers put in our place. But President Trump is not a big fan of the WTO, although we are pretty excited about the fact that Ambassador Lighthizer was involved in the launch of this effort to address e-commerce in the WTO. But what is the CEA's perspective on what needs to be reformed in the WTO, and how we can make it an institution that really gives more momentum in terms of raising the standards for trade, particularly with respect to services?
You know, I think that that WTO, first of all, Ambassador Lighthizer is the person that, along with the president, would set the priorities here. And so I'm going to talk more about the economics of it. But the WTO, has for sure served an important historic function. And I think the WTO is basically a part of leading to the sort of spread of liberal democracy, and the defeat of communism was just like joining up with the capitalists was, made your country prosperous. And the rules that allowed you to do that, involved doing things like joining the WTO, which gave you a kind of good housekeeping seal of approval and made international investors think, oh, okay, well, I'll send my capital to that country because they're in the WTO. It for sure served a useful purpose, but, as you know, you don't have to, as we're luring the countries away from the Soviet umbrella, we didn't have to require them to set their tariff and non-tariff barriers to zero. Rather, they just had to sort of treat everybody the same. And so, in some sense, it was a very sound international foreign policy for the U.S. to disarm unilaterally and to sort of not have tariffs on people that we wanted to lure into our under our umbrella, and to allow them to keep them on us if they wanted to, because we were trying to protect the world from communism. And I think that now there's been so much prosperity created by the international trading system that we have to think about, well, what's WTO 2.0 look like? And I think that WTO 2.0 basically moves everybody towards, more symmetrical behavior towards each other, or maybe moves all tariffs and non-tariff barriers to zero. And you can imagine how hard that would be, for example, for agriculture, right? But so in some sense, then you could say that if the economic ideal, the utopian ideal, is that we move towards no more tariffs and no more non-tariff barriers, then you'd have to ask yourself, is the WTO going to help us reach that goal, or is it going to be a hindrance? And I think that that's something that, the people who go to those WTO meetings need to really start to talk about, because if it's a hindrance, then why not just have a sequence of bilateral deals where we knock tariffs and non-tariff barriers to zero, and then everybody, all around the world wouldn't need the WTO because they would have just agreed to the correct thing. And the other thing is that the WTO does have dispute settlement processes, and you can file complaints there. And I know that China has, engaged in a lot of bad activity, which we've brought to the WTO, and then we win. And so you could say, well, you win every time you go to the WTO. Well, it's true, but there aren't really any teeth in that victory very often. It happens, 5 years after the complaint, and the person who had their IP stolen by China is out of business, and so on, and so that the damage tends to be done. And so I think that thinking about, alternatives such as, making things go faster, or even if there's a country like China that breaks the rules over and over and over again, then shouldn't the members insist that it leave the WTO? That I think those are the kind of things that this administration is going to explore and think about.
Since we touched on China, so there's a rebalancing and a reset going on in that relationship, and the president has used the authority under Section 232 and 301 to take specific tariff actions to encourage the Chinese to address some of the longstanding issues that American business has expressed as being problems for our growth and our ability to compete, not just in China, but with China everywhere around the world. Right now, the tariff levels are having a certain effect, but come January 1, when many of the tariffs will go up to 25%, there could be deeper economic implications for the U.S. economy. What role is CEA playing in terms of helping the president think about how these tariffs are going to affect the economy longer term, and or thinking about how to encourage a faster reset so that the impact is more muted going into 2019? Because I got to tell you, we love coming close to 4%, growth in the United States. We want to keep that momentum growing. It's great for business, but those tariffs will start having an impact and slowing some of that growth. So what kind of advice are you guys providing on this whole issue? Right.
So I have to not be responsive to what kind of advice are you giving, because everything's covered by executive privileges. But I can talk about how economists think about the basic problem. And I think that, first of all, if you impose a tax on something, then it's, the oldest rule in the tax incidence rule book is that it's the immobile factor that bears a tax. And so you remember during the tax debate when we were arguing that the corporate tax cut would lead to higher wages in the U.S. because labor bears most of the corporate tax. And the reason is that the high corporate tax in the U.S. chased capital offshore. And so therefore it was the Irish worker who was getting the U.S. capital, and that increased his productivity and wages, and the U.S. worker wasn't. And so workers aren't mobile, and so they bear the tax even though it looks like you're taxing corporate capital. Well, the interesting thing about China, and if you think of the tariff as kind of a tax on their sales into the U.S., is that the immobile factor is actually capital, because they don't let capital move. And so the capital in China is kind of stuck there. And so that if you were to impose a tariff or a tax on their activity, then you would expect that the immobile capital would bear the tax. And so sure enough, if you look at what's happened to Chinese equity markets, there's been a big reduction in the value of Chinese capital, which is exactly what economic models would predict. And so that means that the incidence of this tariff, is falling on the immobile factor. And so certainly it'll have some effect on our economy, but in most cases not much, because instead of buying the product from the Chinese producer, people can buy it from the Malaysian producer or the US producer or so on. It's really bad for the Chinese producer, but the sort of second best price isn't really much different from the first best price once things adjust. And so I think that that's the economics of it. And then the question is just where do we go from here? And one of the things I've noticed in this White House is that President Trump moves really fast. His success very often is based on really strong personal relationships with people. You see that with North Korea, that they've reached a point where they trust each other in a negotiation, and we've made a lot of progress in North Korea. They're not shooting missiles over Japan anymore. And he has a very strong relationship with President Xi. And so I would expect that, that hopefully things work out and they meet at the G20 meeting and we start to move towards an end game in that. But if we don't, then the economics of it would suggest that there's not much cost to U.S. consumers, but a large cost to immobile Chinese capital.
Well, in that case, we are hoping that the meeting between President Trump and President Xi is a good one and does lead toward an end game. And short of that, we would hope then that a lot of these other free trade agreement negotiations that have been launched can be accelerated, because it will be important then to strengthen these other markets and opportunities for U.S. exporters to go in and out of them and address some of the barriers that we face in the Japans, in the European Unions, and I'm counting the UK as part of that for now. And
all that stuff's ongoing, and it's really going fast forward. As a person with USTR experience, you got to admit that the USMCA happened ridiculously fast, right? It really, when nothing like it has ever happened over USTR.
Korea was about 9 months, but it's when there's political will, there's a way, and we have some of the best and the brightest at USTR, and so we're grateful for their advocacy efforts on the behalf of U.S. business. I thought maybe if you're okay with it, we'd open it up to the audience for some questions. I'll need help only because the lights are bright, so we won't be able to identify anybody who's got a question. I'll look this way. Come on up, yeah. And if you can, just for the benefit of Kevin, introduce yourself and where you're from.
Sure, thank you. Jonathan Gold, National Retail Federation. Thank you very much for being here this morning. I want to take exception, unfortunately, with your last comments with regards to the China tariffs. For the members that I represent, both small and large retailers, they're already seeing impacts from the prices, especially this latest round, which are hitting many more consumer goods than we've seen from the List 1 and List 2. And we're extremely fearful of the impact of List 4, which will be a majority of consumer products, things like apparel, footwear, toys, consumer electronics. We're already seeing price increases, especially for our smaller members. They're getting from their vendors that they're being hit with a price increase. Many of those folks can't accept that price increase, so they'll be forced to pass that along to the consumer. And I think as far as pushing supply chains out of China, it's a little bit more complex than that. It takes companies months, if not years, to find the appropriate vendors to make up for the products that they're selling out of China. You've got to go through an entire process to audit the factory, make sure they can produce the products that you have to your quality standards, make sure they can produce to the quantity you desire. And it takes time to do that. So those additional costs that go into that will then be part of that price of the product as well. So it's not going to be a zero-sum game here. I think you're going to see increases and impacts to the economy going forwards, not just from retailers, but we also have the impact of the retaliatory tariffs that many of our U.S. exporters are seeing as well. And some of those folks are being hit kind of the double whammy, as they're getting hit because of the tariffs on inputs to production, as well as getting hit on the outbound as well. So I just want to make that point clear. And I think something else, back to Laura's point on USMCA, as far as what shouldn't be in future free trade agreements, on the de minimis, we'd love to see getting a little footnote that could allow the U.S. to roll back the benefits we've seen from the increase in the de minimis. We think that's extremely positive. So we would love to see that kind of come out of any future FTAs. And to be honest, we'd love to see that come out of the USMCA as well. So. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. And of course, we're monitoring this situation closely, watching the prices of really thousands of classifications of goods. And there's a very well-developed waiver system when particular hardships are spotted, and the Secretary of Commerce and Bob Lighthizer are involved in dealing with those waiver applications. But the zero-sum game, so first of all, trade isn't really a zero-sum game, right, in the sense that we can all be better off if we could move to a better trading system. That when you're doing the calculus, you have to understand that, I'm a conservative free trader kind of guy, from the American Enterprise Institute, and I was just stunned to see, we put out a report last fall that China's intellectual property theft for the U.S. is taking 1% to 3% of our GDP every year. And they're doing things like forced technology transfer for firms that operate in China. If U.S. firms want to sell product in China, they have to make it in China. And so if you look at U.S. sales in China, then almost all of our sales in China are produced in China. And if you look at China's sales in the U.S., almost none of the production's located in the U.S. And so there's a lot of room for improving the situation. And I think we're all hopeful that the price changes that you're discussing are temporary, and that they help get China to the tables. But imagine if there was some country that was with their navy taking 3% of our GDP by marauding and so on. Then what would we do? And we've been standing by and letting them do that to us, through the internet and cybercrime and everything else. And President Trump's just not going to stand for it. And so I understand that your guys might be really at the front line of dealing with it. But I'm sure that they'll benefit enormously once we get this thing fixed. And again, if you look at USMCA, you can see that we're making progress in trade.
And don't get me wrong, there certainly are issues in China that need to be addressed. We are 100% behind you on that. Agree, the forced tech transfer, IPR, things like that. We just don't think tariffs are the right way to get there, but that's for a side conversation. As far as the exclusion process, there's no exclusion process for the latest list of tariffs that were just announced, the 10% on the $200 billion. And that's where a lot of this hardship is going to come. So we would strongly encourage the administration, especially USTR, to reconsider the ability for an exclusion process on List 3. We sent a coalition letter to USTR 2 weeks ago. There's a letter signed by 169 bipartisan members of the House that was sent on Monday. So strongly encourage the administration to re-look at the ability for an exclusion process on List 3, and if a List 4 does come out, to make sure that it is part of that process as well.
Thanks for that point. And I wanted to just reinforce a really important point that was just made. And it may sound wonky, but that footnote that he's talking about is everything. Something that was amazing in the USMCA is the real focus that this administration gave to leveling the playing field with respect to competition by private carriers like UPS and FedEx against these giant postal monopolies outside the United States, China Post in particular. They're the ones that have been bringing in the fentanyl and the carfentanil, leveraging the Universal Postal Union Treaty to be able to bring things in under the cover of darkness. That footnote is critical because it's not really leverage against foreign actors. Lowering that footnote only plays to the posts who don't have to follow the same processes at the borders. So the only people that it'll hurt is actually the private carriers who are bringing in those inputs and those goods that small and medium-sized businesses use to produce the next great American export that we hopefully are shipping back out. And so it's just something to look a little bit closer at. It was a powerful change in U.S. customs policy that really unleashed a lot of economic dynamism, and it's not the leverage point that everyone thinks it is, because the trading system isn't perfect. There's a lot of actors, a lot of postal monopolies, to be specific, that aren't covered by the rules of the game, and we need to be making sure that there's opportunities for continued growth, not at the expense of private companies. But I will give incredible congratulations to the administration for the real focus it's given to this issue, because the language that deals with state actors, government-owned or government-sponsored entities, particularly on the postal side, got some of the most world-class language ever. Take that and put that in every free trade agreement, and you'll hear loud cheers. So. And
I could say that it's one of the surprises about being a geeky economist and showing up at the White House is that you end up working on things you never thought you'd work on. Right. And it's amazing how much work we've done at CEA on UPU. issues. Even one of our top guys went to a conference in Ethiopia.
Yes,
and I think that you're going to see a lot of interesting development in that space.
We're pretty excited about it, actually. Yeah. Let's turn to another question.
Marilee, International Trade Today. You mentioned how with the USMCA, it kind of reassured people who were concerned that Trump just wanted to slap tariffs on everything and not get deals. The day that he announced USMCA in the Rose Garden, he mentioned the steel and aluminum tariffs that are still in place on Canada and Mexico, and said those aren't going away. We got to protect our steel. So could you address that question? People had thought those would be resolved in USMCA, and they're not. And there's not a lot of transparency into what might be the future for them.
Sure. I mean, that's a question to send to USTR, but I think that in order to close the deal, they agreed to sort of table that and come back to it at another time. As in terms of whether there's progress to announce on that, you'd have to ask the people that are directly involved.
We have time for one or two more questions. Doesn't it feel good? You've answered them all.
I've answered them all. I've answered all the questions.
Yeah. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your insights and comments. I'm Sherry Stevenson from the ICTSD. It's a think tank in Geneva. Just to pick your brain a little bit, other than the digital aspect and the e-commerce chapter, which is a great advancement in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, is there anything else specific relative to services? For example, in terms of the non-conforming measures that were there previously, that date now from 25 years, is there any area of liberalization that you can point to or think of in the agreement that where it advanced services and services companies' abilities to trade within North America, other than the digital chapter, which is obviously a huge progress?
You know, that's actually a better question for you than for me, because it's down into the weeds of which of the 1,000 things do you guys think are most important. But I would guess that the labor rules, that like Mexico actually having 21st century labor laws agreeing to give their workers collective bargaining rights and so on, would make it so that you'd have a more level playing field in the labor space. But maybe you have other things.
Well, and there I was going to come right back to the new language that's in the agreement with respect to competition, particularly with state-owned and state-sponsored actors. But I will say that CSI and the CSI team, led by Christine and Chantel and Hera and Albert, are coordinating all of the perspectives of our membership in terms of all the benefits of the USMCA, as well as some of the issues that we would like further work to be done on. And I'd really urge you to check out the CSI website, because there's a wealth of information and additional analysis being done as we pour through the text of the agreement to provide our perspectives to Capitol Hill on the value of the agreement for our industry sector. So definitely check out the website, because there's some great information out there. So, last question.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about the steel and aluminum tariffs again, because there was I'm sorry, I'm Doug Palmer with Politico, because there was a report out of Mexico that the U.S. was asking Mexico to agree to a quota on steel imports instead of the tariffs. I just wondered if you can confirm that. And just a bit of an editorial comment. You said, ask USTR. Well, I have to tell you, I ask USTR questions, all the time. and
we love you for that.
and the amount of times I get answers is pretty low. And even when USTR is asked about this in public, they say, well, that's a Commerce Department issue. So it's sort of frustrating. You don't really know who in the administration to go to get an answer. But if you happen to have the answer to the question, I would love to hear it today. Is the U.S. asking Canada and Mexico to swap tariffs for quotas on steel and aluminum?
Yeah, I'm sorry that you once again asked the wrong guy, but I can say that I understand, or you should understand too that covering negotiations is particularly challenging. Maybe you should send this answer to your boss because people who are negotiating are making offers, or what about this, what about that, and until there's a final deal, then maybe it's much different from the offers, and so it's really wrong if you're putting stuff on a table with a negotiating partner that you trust to sort of leak to the press, what your asks are, because then you might be pressuring them through the media, and it might be viewed as unsportsmanlike. And so I think that USTR, Bob Lighthizer has shown that he's a great negotiator, and I know that must be at times frustrating for people who are trying to cover it because he's holding his cards close, which is what you would want in a good negotiator. But I'm sorry, I don't have anything to add on that specific question, which you anticipated. Thank you.
I don't know if you wanted to make any closing comments.
No, it's just great to be here. I mean, thank you all for having me, and it's great to hear from you about what's working and not working in the policy space.
Well, I will say we are very lucky to have you as the chief economist to the president, and I just want to leave you with 3 thoughts. 1, services matter. And they are the game changer. They are the power boost for the U.S. economy, and anything the administration can do to not only domestically unleash the power of services across the U.S. economy and really help open markets for us internationally, we will be major contributors to economic growth, as we always have been. And then third, the only other important point to make is it's really important to keep creating that momentum behind support for trade, and anything the administration can keep doing to ensure that trade becomes even more inclusive. UPS is a big believer in the more businesses, the more individuals we can bring into the global trading system, the stronger our economy will be. And so some of the work that's been launched in terms of supporting SMEs and helping them to trade more is really important, focusing on women-owned businesses, the small and medium-sized minority-owned businesses, as well as bringing rural communities into the global economy are going to be powerful, and we hope that through services we'll be able to bring more of those entities using e-commerce, using digital trade, so that they can be part of the global trading system, and that we don't have those geographic, disparities or income inequalities, because we're going to be raising all boats together and engaging in the system. Services will be part of that answer.
They sure will.
So, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.